This is Robert Capuccio. Welcome to the Self-Help Antidote, a weekly dose of reason, perspective, and insight, where we challenge conventional thinking and explore authentic strategies and insights around personal transformation. Our commitment to you is to bring you some of the world's leading experts in the domains of fitness, wellness, coaching, and behavior change, separating fact from fallacy. Alan Questel, welcome to the Self-Help Antidote.
Thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Really excited to talk to you about intentional acts of kindness, as mentioned in your book, as opposed to random acts of kindness. Recently, I was reading an essay by Charles Bukowski, The Crunch, and he talks about we don't need to reinvent things. We don't need new systems and processes or new people. What we need is to change the way we interact. We're just not good to one another. We are just not good to one another. And when I think about that, like, are we not good to one another because inherently we are not good? Or are we not good to one another because we are living in an unpredictable environment where we have such a small locus of control, which exacerbates not only our perception, but the physiological impact of chronic stress. And it causes us to behave in ways that make us even more miserable. And when I think about kindness, I think about we're suffering. We are in some ways a very sick society as of late. And we have the remedy right in front of us, or a remedy, I should say, which is kindness. And we complain about the pain of our affliction, yet we refuse to swallow the remedy because it just seems too dangerous. Talk about what your motivation was to write that book, Practicing Intentional Acts of Kindness.
Well, there were several strong motivations that led me to write the book. And, you know, the title of the book is Practice Intentional Acts of Kindness and Like Yourself More. And I think that the liking ourselves more was one of the first things that led me in this direction. And that came out of a workshop I was putting together on self-image. And I started to think that our self-image was not to be reductionistic, but simply a reflection of how much we like ourselves or how much we don't like ourselves. If I have a good self-image, I like myself. If it's not so good, I don't like myself. And my work over the past decades has been in teaching the Feldenkrais method. And in that, there's a group process that people are led through verbally, and the movements affect changes in breathing, posture, range of motion, reduction of pain, and changes in self-image. And the quality of movement that's always emphasized is to move slow and small, because that actually increases our sensitivity. And after coming up with this workshop on self-image, I started to think that this is my job to help people like themselves more. And I do it in a very simple way initially, which was asking people to move in a way that they like the way it feels. And it's a funny thing. When I'm teaching a workshop and there are people moving very slow and small, and I ask the question, are you moving in a way that you like the way it feels? Many people respond with, no, I wasn't. And that's significant. So when we talk about kindness and the world that we live in, which I agree with everything you said, and at the same time, I have nothing to compare it to, because I don't remember my past lives. So the idea of moving in a way that we like the way it feels and being kind, in a funny way, it's in my experience, both personally and with others, is that it's often easier to be kind to other people, and it's much harder to be kind to ourselves. And so this idea of liking ourselves more is a different starting place than just trying to jump in and be kind to everyone around me. They're both important. They're both significant, right? And so this whole process of liking ourselves more was and is still very intrapersonal within ourselves. And then one day, just by happenstance, and I can't even remember what it was, I did some small act of kindness, and in the next moments, I realized, I feel a little bit better about myself for doing that. I like myself more. And then that was the connection for me. That was like going from the intrapersonal to the interpersonal, to be able to take an action with another that would help me in my own growth and development. And I'm not suggesting that we just do a lot of acts of kindness to pat ourselves on the back, to like ourselves more, but that when we do an act of kindness, we have a chance, an opportunity to like ourselves more, but there's also a chance to affect the world around me, the people around me. And, it needs to start small. The whole idea of kindness it's a big thing. And many people have different values around kindness and perspectives about themselves as being kind or not being kind. And in fact, I think that's worth investigating too. In the book, I actually start with asking people to make different kinds of lists, but not how you would like to be kinder. I start with, how are you already kind? That's a better starting place, to acknowledge that we are doing something, we're capable of something. So that was one of the big drives for me to write the book.
There's so many directions. First of all, thank you for that I want to take this conversation. I'm kind of a sameness seeker. Like, what is the common link between everything you just said? Because there was so much brilliance within that conversation. And it reminds me of when the Dalai Lama was asked in a seminar, one of the questions was, do we need more love in the world? And his response was to chuckle. And then his answer was kind of shocking, because it was, no, we don't need more love in the world. And he pointed out that the most horrible people you'll ever meet probably love their mom quite a bit. And he said, what we need more of is kindness. When you talk about movement, you talk about kindness. It is an action that is impacting the rest of the world, because if we are engaged in acts of kindness, we will generate this interpersonal affinity for one another. We will generate love. If we go out there with the intention of love, the second we get cut off on the highway or the motorway, we lose that intention.
Yeah.
I want to take this conversation in a place that's not so commonly discussed, because I think most people would agree we're not as kind with ourselves as we could be. And sometimes we are much more unkind with ourselves than with other people. But when you talk about movement, how does movement affect how we think and how we feel? What's the link there?
Yeah. So, I mean, what was the word you used? Sameness?
Yeah, I look for, I make sense of the world by how is this, how is peanut butter and jelly kind of like, I don't know, my ring light? I have no idea, but that's how I think.
I agree with you 100%. And I think of sameness, I think of, to me, another way maybe of describing that is what is fundamental to us all. That it's the basis for all of us to have the capacity as human beings to meet at a particular place. So kindness is certainly one. But movement is, in some ways, even more foundational, because movement is at the essence of everything we do. We have thinking, we have feeling on an emotional level, we have sensing, perception, and we have movement. And all of these aspects are actually a way of describing our self-image, and a change in one has the potential to change any of the others. But how accessible is it to change our thinking? It's possible, but then we can trick ourselves and go, oh, I think I'm thinking differently, or we're not. I had an experience years ago in Japan. I was having lunch with a Japanese man who studied linguistics at Harvard, and every few minutes he would just go, you're so Western in how you think. And I was so insulted, because I thought I was very Eastern in how I thought. And now, that was back in 1985. And now, teaching a lot in Japan and places like Taiwan, I've understood now my thinking is Western. Thinking is different. So thinking is a hard thing to come around to change. It's possible, but it's over time. And how do we change how we feel? Well, most of the time we're feeling too much of something, or not feeling enough, or not knowing what we're feeling. And to change that is, well, how many thousands probably books have been written about our emotions and trying to understand them. And in fact, the model I like to think of is a baby who's crying, and you just jingle some keys in front of their face and they stop crying. But can you do that with an adult?
Well, if they're a young adult and they're 16 and they really want the car, I reckon that might work.
Well, that's right. If they really want the car, I was just going to say that if it was a Mercedes or a new vacation home, it would work. That's really insightful. That's great. And so changing how we feel is a long-term process too, because we have to understand what we feel first. And if you want, we can talk later. I have ideas about what a feeling actually is. And then sensing how we take in and process information. That's like at the forefront of neurology today, right? Of trying to understand how we process things. And we know less than probably 0.1% of how our brain and our bodies function that way. But movement is immediate. It's concrete. When you move differently, you feel something different, right? And if we can, when I talk about, I don't know why my picture just went off, sorry.
That's okay.
When we talk about, when I was talking about, like in my classes, asking people to move in a way they like, the way they feel, that's not just for our class. That's for everything we do. If you think about it, I ask people sometimes the question, when do you experience pleasure or look for pleasure? And they'll say things like, oh, when I'm with my kids or grandkids, or when I'm doing sports, or playing a musical instrument, having sex, or eating. Well, if you add all those things up, how many hours a day are you moving or seeking pleasure? It's not much. So we can do that more consciously, more intentionally, in a way that we start to move through our day life. And, as I expressed before, that when I ask that of the students that I work with, when I train people to become Feldenkrais practitioners, it's a 4-year course. So I'm with people for a long period of time, and probably one of the biggest gifts I've ever received from this idea is when I was graduating them, and I'd call out their name and they'd come up and I'd give them a hug. And so many of them whispered in my ear, I like myself more now. And I thought that made it all worthwhile. And I thought, if at the foundation, if we look for sameness again, if we look at your podcast, like, what's the intention behind it, right? And for me, the intention behind everything I do is helping people like themselves more. And movement is akin to action. So as you said, kindness is an action. It's not in the dictionary. It's not written like that. Kindness, it implies certain kind of actions, but it never tells you what to do. And this is one of the faults of most dictionaries, most definitions, is they describe things from the observer's point of view, not the doer's point of view. So like to sit, in some dictionaries it'll say to sit is to rest upon your buttocks or thighs. Sure, that sounds right. But you tell a child with cerebral palsy, rest upon your buttocks and thighs, they'll fall over. It doesn't make any sense. And actually, if I wrote a definition about what really is entailed in sitting, it would be pages long. It would look at the angles of the joints and the vectors and the relationship to the gravity and the flexors and extensors and opposing muscle groups, blah, 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 until you'd be like, I don't know what this is anymore. It has nothing to do with sitting, right? And so kindness is the same thing. It only comes out of an action, and that action is through movement.
I love this conversation. The title of the show is The Self-Help Antidote, which is not an attack on self-help. There's some incredible wisdom that comes out of there. But then there are things that don't make a lot of sense, especially when you weigh it with empirical evidence. I've heard motivational speakers say from the stage with absolute certainty that if you want to change your life, you need to change your thoughts. If you change your thinking today, never allow a negative thought to enter, which a lot of psychologists would say very bad idea, but never allow a negative thought to enter your mind. And then 20 minutes later in the same seminar, they will say, we are not even consciously aware of 95% of our thoughts. So how do I change something I'm not consciously? That's like saying, don't let someone in Bangladesh reach for that plate of food right now.
Right.
Okay, that makes absolutely no sense to me. But what you're saying is that movement is an expeditious way of changing not only physicality, but state, emotional and psychological.
Yeah.
I just did a seminar for a kind of a large labor group. I'm not going to get into specifics. And what they were asking for is solutions around burnout. Nearly 50%, the research is saying 50% of the workforce, in the US anyway, is on the verge of burnout. Like 10 to 15% are suffering from it. Mm-hmm. And the cost, to the human cost and the economic cost, is catastrophic. It's tens of billions. What would be a movement-based tool for when I want to show up as a certain type of person? I want to show up as this kind person, but it doesn't work out that way. My environment and my state are in contradiction. What are some tools that we could possibly use?
Well, it's a very big question. And the best tools, I think, are the simplest ones. The ones that are accessible to us, not someone else's idea what I should do. Like the idea of not having negative thoughts. Whew, that's not a bad idea. That's a good thought. But how do you do that? How do I stop my negative thoughts? And then I have a negative thought, and then I'm judging myself for having a negative thought, and I'm back in the loop of not liking myself and all of that. So the simplest things, and that's always what I'm looking for. In the same way that you talk about sameness, I talk about foundational things. Something has to be readily accessible on an everyday level. Otherwise, we won't do it. I think that's how gyms stay open, right? People go for 2-3 weeks and that's it. And if everyone went who was a member of the gym at the same time, there'd be a fire hazard. It wouldn't be safe to do something like that. So something we can do on an everyday level, and I'll start with this. Coming back to the idea of moving in a way that you like the way it feels, is do that when you leave your desk to go get a drink of water, go to the bathroom. You can't do it all the time. I can't always move around in a way that I like the way it feels, but I can start in a regular way accessing certain times of the day where I'm practicing something. Because it's only through practice that any of these things take hold and become part of the repertoire of who we are. So if I practice this, if I'd say, before I go to bed, I'm just going to walk around the house, turning out the lights, moving in a way that I like the way it feels. And I'm not talking about dancing and swinging your arms. Mm-hmm. I'm just talking about giving some attention to myself in this simple way of doing it. And I can give you another example of a simple action that can develop, I think, exponentially over time. So when I was 19 years old, I moved out of my parents' house. And one of the realizations I had at that time was, I'm not good at anything. Now, at 19, I wasn't even old enough to be a failure at anything. Right? I was too young, right? And I decided I'm going to learn to do one thing well. And again, I just chose something. I chose brushing my teeth. I didn't brush my teeth well, as I was told. And I thought, well, here's something I could practice on my own. And if I don't do it, no one will know. Maybe the dentist, but he knew already probably, right? And so it's something that I could practice twice a day for a couple of minutes, right? And just to see, can I train myself with this simple habit? And that ability to get better at one little thing started to show me how I could be better at bigger things. But it also showed me that what came up just in the event of brushing my teeth were all my patterns and habits about avoiding things, about judging myself, about wishing I was someone else, not liking myself. And it was like, that's a small thing we can start to do. So moving periodically throughout the day, find an activity that no one knows about, so no one can evaluate you about it. You're your own evaluator. And see if that over time, and then this question brings up, which is how much time. So sometimes when I work with people and they want to change something, and I say, well, how long do you think it'll take to change something like this? And they'll say, oh, 3 weeks. And I laugh. I just laugh at it. I go, you got to be kidding. And they say, okay, a month, 2 months, 6 months. No, I think if we're going to change something as deep as our acts of kindness or liking ourselves more, we have to also be realistic with the time frames that it might take to do this that allow us to be kind to ourselves and patient. So I say to someone, I'd say it would take 1.5 years to 2 years to change this. And some people go, oh my God, what are you talking about? How's that possible? And I go, look, if you say 6 months and it hasn't changed, now you just beat yourself up at 6 months and you're a failure and you don't do it again. But at 6 months, if you're not good at it yet and you go, oh, I have another year to go. Oh, and after a year, you come and evaluate it again. Well, I'm not there yet, but I have another 6 months to go. Time is an important factor, as is back to the word practice. It's practice only happens over time.
I just want to stop on this because I think what you're saying is absolutely brilliant. And you brought up the health club analogy. I used to work quite deeply within the fitness industry, and one of the stumbling blocks that people go through are the ones that we in the fitness industry, not to be critical, but just to have a sobering perspective as we put up. There's somehow this belief that if you're really committed, you are going to change everything today. And we don't even have time to get into where the liabilities in that thinking could lie. But one thing, Nathaniel Branden in his book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, said that self-esteem is basically the reputation that you have with yourself. Mm-hmm. So, he was talking about that, and James Petraska, who was one of the pioneers behind the trans-theoretical model of change, said if you change one thing, a small thing, the probability that you will be able to effectively change a second thing doubles. Right. So these things really do matter. But we also have psychological mechanisms such as temporal discounting. I tend to put more value on things that benefit me today than on what will benefit me a year from now. So I think what's important is being mindful of what you're getting and how you're feeling and who you're being in the moment, because it might take you a year or maybe 2 years to change this thing. I think most of the researchers pointed to the formation of a habit is somewhere between 60 to 266 days, which is a range that depends on multiple variables. Yeah. But if you can map what you're doing with your values, with your sense of identity, and a level of enjoyment, or at least significance, meaning in that activity, I think that allows the payoff to be built into the process just a little bit. I just love that idea of the one thing. Sorry to just jump in there, but you made me want to geek out on this.
I agree with you. And I would add something else.
Please.
In terms of change, because, whether it's what I would say is a mistaken idea that I'm going to change all this today, or even the idea that I'm going to change this in 1.5 years or 2 years. You brought up the word evaluate. And the question is, how do we evaluate? And one way that most of us, I think, mistakenly evaluate it is that, is it different now? Is it fixed? Have I changed? It's complete. It's a done deal. I think that's completely unrealistic. I've only met a few people, maybe a couple of people who I felt were enlightened. What the heck does that mean, enlightened, right? I think the best definition of enlightenment I ever heard is you get enlightened, and then you get enlightened again, and then you get enlightened again, because it's something that passes through us. So now that's a big idea. But if we take the idea of changing a habit, let's say the habit of some internal conversation that I'm always having with myself of how I'm no good, right? So when I was brushing my teeth, oh, I'm no good at this, blah, 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 blah. I think one strong evidence of change in any of these things, whether it's doing a sport for liking ourselves more is that when I encounter that voice in my head again, that I don't spend as much time there as before. That instead of spending 3 days beating myself up, I just spend 3 hours beating myself up.
That critical voice.
That critical voice, yeah. That critical voice is not, I don't believe, honestly, that I'm going to get rid of my critical voices. I think that's too much of pressure to put on myself. But what I know in myself, and I've discovered over the years, is I spend much less time there. I don't drive around in that neighborhood as long. And that to me is evidence that, oh, I actually can change something. What I'm changing is the duration of time that I spend in struggle or being unhappy. And if I can change that, then I'm on the right road. And that, again, like you said, it can exponentially increase over time, that it's shorter and shorter. Now, there's one big thing, though, that's a real key thing, which I would like to write another book about, but I don't have a clue of the answer yet, which is, how do I catch that moment? How do I catch myself in that moment of negativity and then change my thinking from there, not stay in the negative thoughts?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
Me neither.
but one thing that I think has always been useful for me and my teams and people I've worked with is, you may not be able to catch yourself in that moment because of a lot of different variables, environmental factors, external and intrinsic environment. But there's always, you talked about evaluation. There's always reflection after the fact and taking account and saying, right, what happened? What was I rushed at the time? What was I feeling? What degree of intensity? What was going on around me as well as within me? Wow, okay. What need maybe was going unmet or threatened? If I had a chance to do that over again, would I do anything differently? And prepare for that. So the next time that happens, instead of doing that, 5 out of 5 times, I might just react that way 4 out of 5 times, then 3 out of 5 times, which, if you take those 3 out of 5 and you put them in semi-high stakes situations, that's significant.
Yeah.
Seems incremental, but it's significant.
No, it's a lot.
So what are your thoughts around, and this is just a random thought that popped into my head, and I want to follow my curiosity around this, that obviously, I'll never be Beyonce. Clearly, I don't have, I could work on my musical prowess for hours a day over the next decade, and I'll get better, but not very good. But I do have maybe other skill sets that, and in all things being equal, if I had an image of who I wanted to be 1 year from today, how would I go about evolving into that person?
Well,
in the context of what we're talking about.
I think that's part of the biggest struggle in our society today, because we measure everything by the number of likes we get and how much approval we get. So if I was going to give myself the task to be the person I'd like to be, or who I'd like to be in a year, the first thing I would need to do is to evaluate it in a realistic way. What's really possible? What can I really expect to change? And I would actually set the bar lower, because we set the bar too high. We have too much of a high expectation of what we think we should be able to do in a certain period of time. And it's just unfair to ourselves when we do that. I don't know if it's along these lines, but it's something I experienced during COVID. Okay. So my work is generally live with people. And during COVID, like one of my groups, I had the chance to graduate them online, which I set my office up with 5 cameras and a switching box, and it was a very fancy setup. And I felt like I gave them 50% of what I really could offer them by being live with them, really clarifying things for them. And I had colleagues who started teaching classes online, and I did some. And to be honest, It wasn't my favorite thing. And my colleagues, though, were getting like 300, 350 people at a time. Now, even if it's only $10 a person, that's a lot of money for an hour, you know? And people started saying to me, you should do this. You're well known in your field. You should do this. You can get a lot of people. And I went, but I don't really care for it. And yet I felt this conflict internally, comparing myself to another, right? And looking at that and thinking, but I should be like that. I should want to do that. And I was clear about what I wanted, so that helped me. But then I had another insight, and I can't say this is true in this way for everybody, but I think there is a way it's true for everybody, which is I sat down one day and I started to think of the number of people that I've taught over the last 4 decades. And when I add up those numbers, it's thousands of people that I had some impact or some influence in their life in a useful way. It's not Beyonce or Brad Pitt who can influence millions of people, but that's what we compare ourselves against. So again, we come into that comparing mind. So when I talk about how do I want to be in a year, I want to choose something that's realistic, right? That's not too high a bar. And if I succeed in that, then I know I can do it and maybe raise the bar a little bit more. And if I don't succeed, that's not a bad thing. There are a lot of things I don't succeed in. But then to be able to reevaluate it and go, okay, what can I accomplish? Maybe it's as small as brushing my teeth well, you know?
Here's where the sameness seeker in me evaluates this whole conversation. Because again, it's a very popular and in our culture, deeply embedded belief system. You want to expect more from yourself than anybody else. You want to have extremely high expectations.
Right.
Now you're saying you want to be measured in your expectancy, which kind of reminds me of something my friend Paul Taylor, he's a neuroscientist out of Melbourne, Australia. And on his show, 2 of you would get on like a house on fire, by the way. He was saying that one of the problems he thinks with depression with young people in our society is that they expect to go online and have 100,000 followers and be making $50,000 a month and being an influencer within a few short months.
Right.
And when reality is so far from that expectation, biochemically, these people are absolutely devastated. Psychologically, they become crushed and unable to move forward. And I think both of these things are interconnected. It's kind of like that saying, if you're working with someone and they just can't see their potential, they can't see how far they can actually go. Your job as a coach or a guide is to just help them go as far as they can see. Because once they get to that vantage point, if you've ever been on a hike, you can see further. And once you get to that next point in the horizon, you can see further and further. And I think these two things, like most things in life, there is a paradox. Both things are true. And there's a high level of intercomplexity and interdependence with these things. They're both essential. And one more thing that strikes, because it keeps coming up, the word evaluation. I think when we're measured in the expectations we have, we get to kind of do a litmus test on, is this really my purpose? See, because of these inflated expectations, a lot of times when you ask a room of people, what's your purpose? They'll almost apologetically say, well, I don't have one. Of course you do. Purpose is when you live your highest values. And those values, when you express them to a certain percent of the people, they're going to impact them as a meaningful contribution as well. That's your purpose. And if your purpose is your community or your household, it doesn't make it any less significant than someone whose purpose touches a continent or is international. But when you are engaged in your real purpose, the thing that is not something you do, but it's resonant within you, learning and errors and evaluation are exciting. It encourages you to move more. When you have a fixed mindset around something, it's probably not because you're a negative thinker. You might not be doing what you're really meant to do. You might be doing what somebody else convinced you, either directly or indirectly, that you should be doing. Yeah. So all of these things that you're saying are just, it's landing with me strongly. I'm sure it's landing with a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, I hope so. And all the things you're saying, again, I mean, they're at the basis of many of our troubles. So this idea of living my purpose, struggled with that for a long time. And I feel fortunate and really happy and lucky that I understand that my purpose is to help people like themselves more. And that's not saying like with my book, for example, people say, how many copies have you sold? And I go, I don't care. You know, I'm happy. I'm not in it for the money. I'm in it to perpetuate this sense of quality of life for more of us. And if I can reach, if 10,000 people wrote me, I wouldn't know what to do. But you know what? When 2 or 3 people write me, I can respond to it and feel satisfied that that's enough when I do something like that. And this whole, the idea that you were talking about depression and Paul Taylor's insights into it, which I think are very accurate. I have another perspective on depression that doesn't exclude the one you described. I would say it's an addition to that. And this came to me in a funny way. I was working with a man who he was referred by a colleague, and I haven't told this story for a while. I'm going to tell it, and I don't imagine he's alive anymore. It's many years ago, so it's probably safe to tell it. He was a dentist, and he came to me. He was a little cuckoo too, because he was meditating while inhaling nitrous oxide, laughing gas. And that's okay. Okay, something's wrong. And he heard that
could be some people's version of a good time, but anyway.
Yeah, right. he heard that doing that would cause loss of short-term memory. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I gave him some memory exercises to play with, and the next week came back. He knew where to come. He knew what time. He knew how much to pay me. His short-term memory was fine. But this guy, and I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but as far as I'm concerned, he was one of the most depressed people I've ever met. His voice was completely flat in everything he said. There was no affect at all. He didn't like being a dentist. He had been married, and his wife died in childbirth, and he gave the kid up for adoption. And then later on, Scientology took all his money. And this guy was just flat. And he came for this reason that didn't have any foundation to it. And I started working, and he didn't feel anything. He couldn't feel differences. So then I started approaching him in a way that I would do the same things with him, so I could, on one side, so I could emphasize a difference, so he could feel something. And anyway, our work went on for a number of months. Maybe 6 months into it, I was working with him, and he kind of sheepishly looked at me and said, you know, I never did those memory exercises you were talking about. I got him. I said, oh, really? That's interesting, because that's your short-term memory. So obviously you have a short-term memory. And he went into this whole negative loop, how he should have done it, what was wrong with him, and blah, blah, blah. And I had been studying the work of Milton Erickson at the time. He was a psychiatrist, developed something called Ericksonian hypnosis, which is a very different way of thinking. And I said to this man, I said, look, I want you to do something for next week. I said, I want you to not do all the things I told you to do, and to make sure when you're not doing them, you set aside enough time that they don't interfere with each other. And he kind of looked at me like I was crazy, and he kind of chuckled. And I said, okay, we're done. And he came back the next week, and I'm like, I'm really wanting to ask him, like, but I don't say anything. And halfway through the session, he goes, I didn't do what you wanted me to do. And I go, great, because that means he did what I wanted him to do. And then he said, but I realized I had a choice. And I thought, oh, that's a good definition of depression, the lack of choice, that how things are now will always be this way. And it's like a death sentence for people. But if we can introduce more choice, in someone's experience of themselves, then there's the possibility of movement again between things, right? If I'm in a bad relationship, I can stay in the bad relationship or be alone. That's a crummy choice. I'll take what's known. But if I can move someplace and meet someone else or do something different, just that third variable starts movement happening through my life in a way that makes a difference. So I think we can measure all of the, one of my best friends just passed away. Wonderful man, a neuroscientist, wrote 40 books, lectured at Cambridge. And one day he called me up and he was doing research on serotonin levels at Harvard. And he calls me up and he says, we've proved it. Proved what? And he said that there's less serotonin when someone's depressed. And I said, great, but then I have a question. Are they depressed because there's less serotonin? Or is there less serotonin because they're depressed? And he went, oh, that we'll never know. And so it's like the chicken or the egg kind of thing. So all of those things, these are such interesting ideas and things to learn about, have some understanding and insight. But I keep reverting back to the action that will make a difference.
That's just another perspective, because intentional actions are a demonstration of a level of agency. I mean, Milton Erickson was brilliant. I mean, he also, for very unfortunate circumstances, had a lot more time on his hand to observe intensely multiple aspects of human behavior from his bed. And I just want to delineate that we're talking, there's two different things. There's someone who is in a state of feeling depressed versus clinical depression. I just want to just state that.
Good distinction,
as well as empathetically be sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of variables. Mm-hmm. There's never one thing as the solution to one thing. Most things are not that simple.
Yeah.
But I think that when it comes to agency, one of the antidotes for emotional struggling is to, as you said, do something because of the nature of the thing itself, not necessarily the outcome, and to intentionally evaluate and choose to get better at that thing. I believe that's a life that is exciting, and it's one of the sources of motivation. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, again, on a show, and he's got a very popular show out of Australia, and he was saying, I think almost half facetiously, we were talking about leading teams, and a CEO that I had worked with that was highly invested in the development and the experience of his people first and foremost. I said, yeah, but at the end of the day, businesses are there to perform.
Right.
Almost like as if you could choose being immersed and really enjoying something, or developing your people so they love the environment at work, or high performance. As if you walked into, let's say, retail, and the people that were there, I mean, think about the old Disney. I went to Disney recently, and it's not like the old Disney at all. But when you used to go there, the people were on fire, and they were just so happy. And they weren't employees. They were cast members. And there was a level of performance. And it's like, well, if people are really enjoying what they're doing, it's aligned with their highest values, and they're being invested in so that they're getting better and better. Like, in what scenario would that produce lower work output?
Right.
Because if that's the case, you've hired the wrong people. It's basically your fault. I just want to bring that up because surprisingly, and at the same time, not surprisingly, I've heard that many times. Like, well, you got to be careful about really enjoying what you're doing. I had a business partner that if I said, I really enjoyed that presentation we gave, he would get very nervous. Look, it's about the outcome. It's not about, because if I was absolutely depressed and self-conscious, I'm sure the audience would have been far more impacted and wanted to work with us to a much greater degree. It's just, again, everything is interconnected. And I love what you're saying because it's palatable.
Here you bring up something that, if I come back to my work teaching the Feldenkrais method, which is largely, it's largely around movement and awareness. And Feldenkrais was once asked, can you describe the Feldenkrais method in one sentence? And he said, know thyself. And so it's a way of knowing ourselves. But there's one thing that's so unique about its context that I, so far, haven't found it in this way in any other place. And that is that it's outside of the context of our everyday life. In most movement, if I'm skiing and I want to improve my skiing, I'm attached to an image I have about skiing and how I want to do it and what mountains I want to be able to go down now that I couldn't go down before. And there's all these very concrete kind of outcomes related to the sport and my self-image in the sport. But in a Feldenkrais lesson, you're moving in a way that you like the way it feels and you don't know what the lesson's about. So often they develop in a way that you kind of pressured into staying in the unknown, finding out, discovering something. And at the end, it almost always results in some change of feeling or quality of movement or ability of movement. And when you find that, you go, oh, I'm learning how to learn in a different way. And for most of the things that we measure ourselves by, they're everyday contexts that, like being good at business. How do you be good at business? Brushing your teeth is a good example, again, of something simple enough that no one knows about it, that no one can measure me by it, and I can only measure myself. But if I'm in the context of no context, of finding a way of just moving across my house before I go to bed, and I like the way it feels, who's going to know? What's the measurement in that? But that adds up.
Yes, right? It does.
And that's the thing that's most significant, is these little changes really add up in some way. And, all the things we're talking about, I want to be clear that it can sound very interesting, even seductive and worthwhile, but I believe doing these things takes courage. To be self-reflective means that I have to be willing to keep going even when I don't feel like it.
Yeah.
It's like, the Nike thing, just do it, right? Which is a great slogan for something. But the people I meet who buy into that slogan, they just do it no matter what, and they hurt themselves very often. So how do you do it? That's that small window. For many, many years, I meditated every day, and I woke up in the morning and I just did it. Because if I thought just for a second, should I? The answer would be no. I'm in a warm bed. I don't want to get up. It's dark outside. Why would I get up and sit in a cushion and listen to my own thoughts? Blah, 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 all that noise. But the minute I was there, I felt better because I took action in a simple way that could build over time. And so the courageous part is being able to stay in it. I can tell you a story. I've had many of my graduates and other practitioners come to me and say things like, my practice isn't what I'd like it to be. And we'd have a conversation. Have you tried this? Yes. Have you tried this? Yes. Have you tried this? No. Try that. And 3 months later, they get back to me and they said, well, I did it and it didn't really work. Same conversation. Have you tried this? Yeah. This? Yeah. Have you tried this? No. Try that. And this usually happens about 3 or 4 times. And I always get to the same conversation at the end of those 3 or 4 months. Have you tried this? Yes. Have you tried this? Yes. Have you tried this? No. But I'm not comfortable doing that. And the people who tolerate a little bit of discomfort, the practices take off. And the ones who don't, it stays the same. Mm-hmm. So then we have to consider the question of comfort too. Like if I ask you the question, when do you decide to get comfortable? Just what's your first thought? When do you get comfortable?
Me, I get comfortable kind of like at the end of a very long day. When I'm just like chilling out. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And that's a great way to do it. But the answer I hear the most, people say, well, I guess I get comfortable when I'm uncomfortable. That means that now, if you think about that, that's a crazy criteria. That means you have to be uncomfortable before you get comfortable. So we have a lot to learn about being comfortable through our discomfort, not staying uncomfortable to the point where it's injurious to us, but checking in throughout the day going, could I get a little more comfortable? I'm sitting at my desk. It's the same thing as walking to the water cooler or the bathroom with pleasure. Like I'm sitting there going, wait, I'm comfortable, but I could actually get a little more comfortable. That's how kids regulate their world. Kids do things entirely out of their sense of comfort. And they learn to inhibit that and not feel themselves clearly and get in their own way as a result of it. So the courage that it takes to do something means that it's not always going to be comfortable.
I think that is an important point on tolerating discomfort. I would go a step further, embracing discomfort. I think part of the problem with our society is we have so many sound bites and we're bombarded with so much information that we start to believe things without context. And, you know, one of the things that you hear is, well, most people are struggling because they're lazy and they don't want to do the work. They want the outcome. They want the pleasure. They don't want the process. I think human beings are designed exactly opposite. It is rewarding the engagement in the process that allowed us to survive as a species this long. Right. So far, so good. We'll see what happens. But I think for a lot of people, it's what they believe and what they doubt about themselves. And those erroneous beliefs. I think one of the beliefs are, well, stress is just bad for you. All stress is deleterious. And well, certain intensities and durations of stress and context of stress can be horrible. But when you think about anything in your life that is worth having, worth living, if you think about yourself sitting in a rocking chair at 85 years old, reflecting back on your life, the memories that you treasure the most were all stressful. The first time you saw him or her across a room and you took that, what seemed like the longest walk you ever took in your life, that was exhilarating, but that was very stressful. Your team won, you graduated uni, you got your first job that you had been working towards for so long. These are very stressful things. So stress, it's like the Yerkes-Dodson curve. There could be too much, but without a little bit of stress, life really sucks. And it's completely boring. And what I love about what you are saying is when you're immersed in the process, rather than being outcomes are important, obviously, without being completely indexed towards the outcome. You don't start telling yourself stories about what something means. A failure it's the essence of learning. Like you talk about learning to learn. If I know exactly what is going to happen and that thing happens, I don't learn. It's when I kind of have an idea. I have a hypothesis about what's going to happen. Oh, but that happened instead. Ooh, isn't that interesting? And sometimes those are devastating because you have your identity. I just had a massive setback related to work that really did hurt. But a lot of times it's like, oh, wow, what did I learn from that? Isn't that curious? And those failures are what allow you to grow far beyond what a series of successes would produce.
Sure. We were talking before about success in different ways and the dissatisfaction that people have of not getting it soon enough. And I can't imagine having a conversation with someone who's successful without them hearing of all the things we're talking about. Their struggle, their stress, their failures, that no one achieves something, boom. Even though they pop onto the scene all of a sudden and we never heard of them before, they've been doing these things for a long time.
Absolutely.
But now, to bring it back to a more personal level. So I had a woman in a public class once ask me, I really don't like this kind of question. She said, what's the point of this work anyway? I'm like, oh, God, well, I don't. Feldenkrais could say the point of this work is to make our lives easier, more comfortable. And she was sad, but my thought was like, you're paying money for an extracurricular activity. What's the value for you? You have to tell me what's the point of this work.
Exactly.
But then I came back the next week and I said, I left something out. I said, the point of this work is to learn how to struggle well. Because you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle. We can't eliminate struggle. And if we did, like you said, What's the interest in it? We don't learn anything from that. It's boring, right? So being engaged in a struggle is a useful thing to a degree. If it impedes me from taking action, then I'm heading in the direction of depression, even clinical depression, where it's a point where it's like, this is no longer serving me. But to be able to go, oh, I can tolerate a little bit more struggle, and it's like, I think that being sensitive is a high value. When I hear someone they say, I'm too sensitive, I said, that's redundant. It's the way you're sensitive that may not be serving you, but you can't be too sensitive, right? It's the way you act out of your sensitivity that can propel you forward or stop you in your tracks, right? And so, again, we come back, if I come back to the acts of kindness and thinking, well, here's something I can do on a regular basis, tipping in a restaurant, right? Here's a funny story. So, by the way, in my book, the part about being kind to ourselves, when I started writing that, I got blocked for about 5 years.
Blocked for 5 years?
I couldn't. I realized I thought I was kind to myself, but the more I investigated it, the more I realized I don't think I was really kind to myself. And so
I resemble this culprit.
Yeah, I think that's common for many of us. It's like I said, it's harder to be kind to ourselves than to others. Feldenkrais flipped around, do unto others as you would do unto yourself, is do unto yourself as you would do unto others. Not so easy, really not easy to take care of ourselves in this way. So anyway, I'm writing this chapter about generosity, and I give a simple example of an everyday action of tipping. So my typical tip would be 20% in a restaurant. And so I suggest whatever it is, if it's 10%, 15, 20, 25, for every $5, add on another $1. $1 isn't going to make that much of a difference to most people. And if it does, don't do it, of course. But to add on another $1, if you have a $20 tip and you give the person $24, they feel that. And literally, as I'm writing that night I go out to dinner with some friends. It's a local place. I pick up the check, and it's about $70, right? So 20% be about $85. And then I thought, I'm going to give more. And I go in my pocket, and all I had was a $100 bill. And I immediately went, oh, no, I can't do that. That's way too much. What am I thinking? Oh, my God, that's crazy. And then I realized, oh, there's an example of the struggle of myself, of how I have to move beyond my initial feelings and act in a different way. And I gave the $100. And the best thing was, when I got to the door to leave the restaurant, the waitress came up to me and said, you just made my night. And I thought, it really doesn't take a lot to make a difference for other people. And
there's a lot, there's so much to that. Again, the fact that your behaviors, and you got immediate impact from that.
Yeah.
There's immediate feedback.
Yeah.
But our behaviors do have a tendency to shape our beliefs and our thoughts. Like people say, well, your beliefs shape your behaviors, and this is true. But behaviors can also have a mutually reinforcing impact on thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, and who you are for yourself and others.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of that evening could make the difference of just living your life and a life really worth living. And I understand more and more people are going through either real scarcity or the perception of scarcity. It's like, I'm not doing that. I don't get enough. I don't do. Right. It doesn't have to be just about the money. It has to be about, I'm just going to give just a little bit more.
That's right.
And the changes in your brain, the changes in your experience of the world, the changes in your interaction, and because our interactions are always reciprocal to some degree, and how people react to you, the difference is enormous.
Yeah.
It's these seemingly inconsequential inputs that over time completely reconstruct the output, which is your experience of life. And, I cannot thank you enough for being on this show. This was a deeply insightful and enjoyable conversation. tell us where we can find you, buy your books.
Great.
Get to know about
you. You can find me on the website for my book is practicing-kindness.com. And then you'll get information about the book and all kinds of other things too, a sample worksheet, things like that. If you just Google my name, you'll find I have a few other websites and other places where I have lots of articles and recordings available, things like that. And so that's another access point. And you can usually reach me through the email addresses on some of the websites, and I'm pretty responsive. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to do that. My book is a paperback and a Kindle. I call it a Kindle, kind of like that, Kindle.
Very clever.
And also an audio book, and that's all available on Amazon. So those are the easiest ways to find me. And I want to say I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I had a great time, and thanks again for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Alan Questel, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Visit us at theselfhelpantidote.com to share your feedback, insights, and recommendations on what topics you'd like us to explore in the future.